Archive X. Nibbles by X. Stelmack.
Fading sunlight stretched over the narrow alleyways of Tehran as Taha navigated the crowded streets. Thoughts of his daughter, Emine, clouding his mind. Ever since his wife, Layla, had passed, Emine's once vibrant smile had disappeared. She was quiet now, her eyes reflecting a depth of sadness that weighed heavily on the once warm atmosphere of their home. Months had passed, and despite Taha's efforts, visits to the cafe they used to frequent, afternoons at the park, even a trip to the zoo, Emine remained distant. Her grief was an abyss, cutting her off from the world and from him. Words barely escaped her lips, and when they did, they lacked the warmth they used to hold. That's why, when she asked for a hamster, Taha saw it as a chance, a glimmer of hope. If a little animal could rekindle even a hint of her former self, of course he'd get one without question. The pet shop was tucked away down a quiet side street, a place he'd never have known about if he didn't pass it every day on his way to work. Stepping inside, the scent of sawdust mingled with the faint sounds of chirping birds. The place was filled with cages, each housing a small creature. Behind the counter sat an elderly man, his thinning hair catching the dim light, sharp eyes meeting Taha's.
"Looking for something in particular?"
The man asked, his voice like gravel.
"A hamster,"
Taha replied.
"For my daughter."
An eyebrow lifted slightly, and the man gestured toward the back of the shop.
"Not many ask for those anymore,"
he muttered, leading Taha past rows of cages. Among them, a small hamster caught Taha's attention. Its fur, a fluffy blend of brown and white, was flecked with dust as it burrowed into its bedding, unconcerned by their presence.
"That one's quiet,"
the shopkeeper said, his eyes tracking Taha's reaction.
"Perfect for a kid."
Taha leaned in closer, spotting a faint mark on the hamster's ear, a number barely noticeable.
"What's this?"
he asked, squinting to read it. 1897. The man shrugged.
"From the breeder."
Taha had heard of dogs and cats and livestock being tattooed with identification markings. But a hamster? It was weird, but the creature seemed normal and healthy.
"I'll take him,"
he said, paying the man. The shopkeeper quickly packed the cage, his face betraying no further emotion. Hopefully the hamster would be the start of his daughter's recovery from grief, he thought. Though even as Taha stepped out of the shop, a subtle weight settled in his chest that he just couldn't shake. At home, Emine sat at the kitchen table, her hands motionless over a coloring book. She barely looked up as Taha entered, her eyes distant.
"Emine,
He said gently, placing the cage in front of her.
look what I brought you."
She remained still for a moment, then slowly lifted her head, her gaze sharpening as she stared at the cage. With trembling hands, she reached for the latch.
"You got me a hamster."
Her voice, small but joyful, caught Taha off guard. It had been so long since she had shown even the faintest glimmer of excitement.
"He's all yours."
Taha said, feeling hope rise in his chest.
"I thought we could call him Nibbles, but you can name him whatever you like."
Her fingers brushed the hamster's fur, and a small smile appeared at the corner of her lips.
"I like Nibbles."
She whispered, pressing the hamster to her cheek.
"Thank you, Baba."
Taha stood quietly, watching her. For the first time since Layla's passing, the crushing grief in their home felt just a little lighter. Weeks passed, and as they did, Emine's attachment to Nibbles grew. She spent hours with him, letting the hamster roll around in his plastic ball, laughing as he navigated the house. That laughter, a sound Taha thought he'd lost forever, returned, if only for brief moments. But not all was well. It started at school. One day, Taha received a call from Mrs. Farahani, Emine's teacher. Her voice was uneasy.
"We need to talk about Emine,"
she said. Taha frowned.
What happened?
"She's frightening the other children.
Mrs. Farahani explained.
She tells them strange stories. Stories about scary, made-up places and tunnels which lead to them. The other students avoid her now."
That night, Taha found Emine sitting on the floor, Nibbles nestled in her lap, her fingers absent-mindedly stroking the hamster's fur.
Emine,
Taha began gently, kneeling beside her.
your teacher called today. She said you've been telling stories. Stories that make the other kids afraid.
Emine blinked, her gaze distant.
I didn't want to scare anyone. I only told them about what I saw in my dreams. Nibbles showed me, Baba. He says there are places we can go together, places he's been before.
Emine, those are just dreams.
He said, voice soft but firm.
Nibbles can't talk.
Her lips pressed together.
But he does. He tells me about Mama, about where she is now.
Taha's chest tightened. He didn't know what to say to his daughter, how to pull her back from the strange darkness she seemed to be wandering into. But then he hadn't known how to talk to her mother either. Despite all his efforts and prayers, he hadn't been able to draw his wife out of the deep depression that has consumed her. Hadn't been able to stop her from murdering herself. Strange occurrences began shortly soon after that conversation. One night, Taha woke to the faint sound of scratching. Initially, he dismissed it as Nibbles in his cage. But as the minutes passed, the noise grew louder, more deliberate. Taha got up and walked down the hallway. Pushing open Emine's door, his heart skipped a beat. Nibbles wasn't in his cage, but was scurrying free across the floor. Taha picked him up quickly, then leaned in to inspect the latch on the cage, still securely closed. The same thing happened again the following night, and the night after that. No matter how tightly Taha latched the cage, Nibbles always seemed to get out. It was the following morning that Taha first noticed a small hole under the kitchen sink. At first glance, it seemed like a simple shadow, but as he moved closer, the void pulled at him, its edges flickering in and out of focus like a ripple on the surface of oily water. His hand hovered over the space, but something in his gut told him not to touch it. He felt a chill radiating from the opening, as if it wasn't just emptiness, but the absence of everything. The next hole appeared behind the couch a few days later, bored neatly through the brick of the wall. It wasn't possible. This wasn't normal, especially the way the hole seemed to faintly shimmer, its edges dark and swirling like the beginning of a storm. Then the third hole appeared beneath the stairs. The wood there wasn't thick, and a hole of any depth should have had light shining through it from the other side. But just as with the other holes, this one seemed unnaturally deep and dark and menacing. These weren't just holes gnawed by a rodent, but something far worse. He hammered sheets of tin over them, then covered those up with furniture, rugs, anything to make them disappear. But he could still sense them, as if they were mocking him for even trying to seal them up. Something was very wrong with that hamster, and he needed to find out what. The next day, Taha returned to the pet shop, hoping for answers, but found the door locked. A large sign read, "Closed until further notice." He stood in front of the shop, staring at the dark windows, his heart sinking.
Looking for the owner.
A voice called from nearby. Taha turned to see a middle-aged man leaning against the wall, smoke trailing from the cigarette in his yellowed fingers.
Yes.
Taha replied quickly.
Do you know what happened?
The man shrugged.
He's been arrested. Apparently, he was selling animals from somewhere he wasn't supposed to. The police came and took everything away.
Taha's stomach churned.
Were they dangerous?
The man raised an eyebrow but said nothing more, his eyes hard to read.
I wouldn't know. But seeing as the cops took them all away, I wouldn't want one as a pet.
That night, while his daughter slept, Taha stole Nibbles away, driving the animal far out of the city to the quiet, barren hills that lay beyond. He hiked far from the road, making sure the hamster was securely locked in its cage, then left it deep in the underbrush, where hopefully it would never be found. But hours later, when Taha finally stepped back into his home, the blood drained from his face. Nibbles sat on the kitchen counter, looking up at him with black, beady eyes. But that wasn't the worst of it. The holes were everywhere, and larger than ever. They yawned open beneath the furniture, dotted the stairs, and had seemingly spread to every corner of his home. Taha bolted for his daughter's room, pulse hammering in his ears. He rushed down the hall, feet barely touching the floor, till he flung open Emine's door. But what lay beyond stopped him cold. His daughter stood staring into a large, gaping hole in the center of the room. The void was unlike anything Taha had seen before, pulsing with a deep, sickly light that twisted at the edges like it was alive. It was no longer just some dark anomaly. This one had grown, expanded, stretching out as if trying to consume the room itself. Taha's voice barely broke through the terror that gripped him.
Emine, get away from there!
She didn't respond. Her eyes glazed over as she gazed into the depths. Her face was calm, too calm. She wasn't afraid. In fact, she seemed peaceful, locked in a serenity that chilled Taha to his core.
Emine!
Taha's voice cracked, his hand reaching out, trembling as he took a step closer.
Please, please come to me.
She turned slowly to face him, her expression detached and distant.
Nibbles says Mama is there. He told me I can see her again.
Taha's heart sank, panic flooding his veins.
No, that's a lie. Nibbles! He's just an animal, Emine, and that hole is dangerous. It's not taking you to Mama. It won't take you anywhere good.
She shook her head, her small hand reaching toward the void.
He said we can all be together again, you and me and Mama, all of us, forever.
Taha lunged forward to seize her.
No!
But it was too late. In one smooth, unhesitating motion, Emine stepped forward, her body vanishing into the swirling darkness, swallowed by the pulsating void. The hole rippled once, twice, and then sealed itself shut, leaving the room eerily silent. Taha dropped to his knees, his mind blank, his breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The spot where the hole had been was smooth now, as though nothing had ever been there at all. His hand reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed against the cold floor. There was no trace of her, no sign that his daughter had just been taken from him. The house felt oppressive, the very atmosphere a cold, suffocating weight. The shadows grew longer, darker, as if they too were mourning what had just happened. Taha's body shook with silent sobs, the reality of everything too overwhelming to process. She was gone. Emine was gone, and just like her mother, taken by something he couldn't understand, and to somewhere he could never follow. And Nibbles, whether a guide or a demon, had led her into that darkness. For long minutes, his knelt there weeping, his mind numb with loss. His family home now felt like a tomb, every corner filled with a suffocating emptiness. But then, behind him, Taha heard a soft scratching sound. Nibbles was still there. Slowly turning, he picked up the little creature, holding its soft, fluffy body in the palm of his hand. It was several days later when the police, summoned by concerned friends and co-workers, forced the door to Taha's home. All seemed normal. There was no sign of a struggle, nor had anyone reported anything out of the ordinary. But of Mr. Rezai and his daughter, there was no sign. The matter was duly investigated, but without a single lead or witness, the case quickly ran cold, and a few months later was filed away as unsolvable. A mystery unlikely to ever be solved. Nobody wanted to live in the cursed little house after the suicide and disappearances which had wiped out the Rezai family and locked up tight. The place fell into an unbearable silence, one that only occasionally echoed with the soft, distant sounds of scratching.
Like and subscribe for more horror and mystery stories.